Good evening, and welcome back to History Sales. Somewhere far from home, on the shore of an island that is not his own, a man sits looking out at the sea and quietly weeps. He has, on that island, nearly everything a man is supposed to want. A beautiful goddess who loves him and wants to keep him, food and wine that never run out, and, if he will only say yes, the offer of never growing old and never dying at all. And still, every single day, he walks down to the water and stares out across it, aching for one small thing: he cannot have the sight of smoke rising from the chimneys of his own house, on a stony little island a very long way from here. That man is a king, and his name is Odysseus. It has been almost 20 years since he last saw his home, and tonight's story is the story of how, at long last, he gets back to it. It is one of the oldest stories in the whole world, very nearly 3,000 years old, and it has a name that you already know. It is called the Odyssey. Take a moment to like this video if these slow histories help you drift off, and subscribe only if you truly enjoy what we do here. There is no need otherwise. And if you feel like it, leave your town and your local time down in the comments. There is something quietly good about knowing that someone else, somewhere far away, is lying down to hear the same old story tonight. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, and let the day go. And let's begin in the last hour of a war that had already dragged on for 10 long years. For 10 years, the finest fighters in all of Greece had been camped on the windy plain outside the walls of the city of Troy. And for 10 years, those walls had held. Troy was a real place. You can still climb the hill in what is now the west of Turkey, where it once stood, and see the ruined layers of it stacked one on top of another. And whatever the true war behind the legend actually was, the Greeks remembered it as 10 grinding years of siege that neither side could win. And it is worth saying plainly, before we go any further, a great deal of what follows tonight is legend. Giants and witches and gods who reached down into the lives of men. But the world lying underneath the legend was real, and men have dug it back out of the Greek earth. The great halls and the deep harbours and the burned walls, and wherever the story and that real world touch, I will point it out to you as we pass. And then, in a single night, it was over. It ended not with a great battle, but with a trick. And the trick, the story tells us, was the idea of Odysseus himself, which tells you very early exactly what kind of man we are following. The Greeks built an enormous horse out of wood, hollow inside, and into that hollow they hid their best warriors. Then they burned their own camp and sailed away over the edge of the sea, and left the great horse standing alone on the empty plain, as though it were a parting gift to the gods, an offering left behind to buy themselves a safe voyage home. The Trojans, after 10 years of war, woke to find the enemy simply gone, and this huge wooden horse standing at their gates. They took it for a trophy, and they hauled it inside their own walls, and they spent the night celebrating the end of the longest war of their lives. And in the dark, while the city slept off its relief, the warriors climbed down out of the horse's belly, threw open the city gates from the inside, and let in the whole Greek army which had quietly turned its ships around and come sailing back under cover of night. What followed was not a battle. It was the end of a city. Troy was burned down to its foundations, its fighting men killed, its women and children carried off, its holy places pulled apart. And I want us to pause on this for just a breath, because it quietly poisons everything that comes after. In the fury of that night, the victorious Greeks did things that even their own gods could not forgive. They cut down men who had run to the altars begging for mercy. They dishonoured the temples. They won. But they won in a way that turned the powers of heaven against them. The very men who had prayed for 10 years to get home safely had, in their last hour of triumph, made certain that the way home would become a punishment. And it was not Odysseus alone who would pay for that night. The great army that had fought as one for 10 years came apart almost the moment it left the shore. The kings fell to quarrelling among themselves over when and how to sail. The gods sent storms down to scatter them across the water. And of all those proud men who had lived through Troy, some drowned within sight of Greece, and some were blown to the far corners of the earth for years. And some, and this is the cruelest part of all, and we will come back to it before the night is done, some did reach their own harbours safely, only to walk in through their own front doors and find a welcome waiting for them, far deadlier than any storm at sea. Coming home, in this story, is never the simple, happy thing that the word makes it sound. Coming home is the whole problem. It is the thing this entire poem is quietly about. So the great fleet that pushed off from the smoking ruin of Troy was, though no one aboard could feel it yet, already under a shadow. The men on the decks felt only the wind and the salt and the enormous pull of home. All across Greece, on 100 islands and headlands, families were standing on the shore, watching the horizon for their kings to come sailing back. And on one small stony island far away in the west, a young woman and a little boy were watching the sea as well. The island was called Ithaca. The young woman was named Penelope, and the child at her side was Telemachus, who had been a baby in her arms on the day his father sailed away, and could not truly remember his face at all. 10 years is a very long time in the life of a child, but the war was finished now, and the ships were coming home, and surely one of those sails would soon come around the headland and be his. Keep that harbour in the back of your mind through everything that follows, because that quiet watching is the still centre. The whole enormous story turns around. Every mile that Odysseus is about to be dragged, in the wrong direction, across the entire width of the world, is one more mile away from that harbour, and that lamp, and that waiting woman, and that boy. Now, back to the water. Odysseus set out for home with 12 ships and their crews, a few hundred men of Ithaca and the little islands near it, fathers and sons and brothers who had lived through 10 years of war and wanted nothing in the world now except to see their own homes again. And in the very first thing that happens to them, you can already see the whole shape of the ruin to come, laid out small. The wind carried them first to a place called Ismarus, a coastal town belonging to a people called the Sirens, and Odysseus and his men did to it what men of that hard world did to any town that was not a friend. They attacked it. They stormed the place, cut down its defenders, and carried its people and its wealth back to the ships to be shared out. By the brutal rules of that age, this was simply how the sea roads worked. But there was one man in Ismarus that Odysseus chose to spare, and it is worth slowing down for, because it matters more than anyone could have guessed. His name was Maron, a priest of the god Apollo, and he lived with his family in a grove sacred to that god. In return for the lives of his household, Maron loaded Odysseus with parting gifts, gold and silver, and, most importantly of all, a great skin of wine. This was no ordinary wine. It was dark and sweet and so enormously strong that when Maron drank it at home, he mixed a single cup of it with 20 cups of water, and even then, the sweet smell of it filled the whole room. Odysseus took that wineskin and stowed it deep in his ship and thought very little more about it. Hold that wine in the corner of your mind. Many days and many disasters from now, on a far worse shore than this one, that single skin of wine is going to be the one thing standing between Odysseus and a very ugly death. And then Odysseus, who was always the one thinking a step further ahead than anyone around him, told his men the one thing that would have saved them. "Take what we have," he said, "and let us go, now. Quickly, before this turns back on us." He wanted every man aboard and the beach behind them before the sun was properly up. His men would not hear it. They had wine now, jar after jar of it, hauled up from the town and sheep and cattle down on the sand, and they were sick of the sea and hungry for a proper feast. So they stayed. They built their fires on the beach, and they drank, and they killed and roasted the animals, and they made a long, loud night of it, right there in hostile country, in no hurry at all. And while they feasted, the Cicones they had beaten did not simply vanish. The ones who had gotten away ran inland to their kinsmen, other Cicones who lived up in the hills, more of them, and harder fighters, and at first light they came pouring down onto the shore. Odysseus and his men, slow and thick-headed from the long night, suddenly found themselves in a real battle against fresh troops out in the open. They held through the morning, but by evening the day had turned hard against them, and they broke and ran for the ships, and out of each of the 12 crews, 6 men never made it back to the sea. 6 men from every ship, dead on a beach they had had no good reason to still be standing on, killed. In the end, not by the enemy's strength, but by their own refusal to leave when their captain had told them to. Hold on to that pattern, because you are going to watch it happen again and again and again, all the way to the far end of this story. Odysseus is clever, and he is usually right, and his men, over and over, do not do the thing he tells them, and every single time, it costs lives that could have been saved. The poem warns you of this in its very first breath, that his men perished through their own sheer folly, and that, However hard he tried, he could not save them. This beach, with its 6 dead men from every ship, is where that long and sorrowful pattern begins. They rowed away from Ismarus grieving glad to be alive, and heavier by a great many friends than when they had set out. And they had not gotten far when the sky itself turned against them. As they came around the southern tip of Greece, a stormy cape called Malea, a place that real sailors of the ancient world genuinely dreaded, a great wind came down out of the north and took the whole sea in its fist. It drove the little fleet off its course, past the last islands they knew by name, and then past those as well, out and out and out, for 9 days, across water that no map of theirs had ever charted. And somewhere in the middle of those 9 days, without any of them being able to say quite when, something changed. They crossed a line. They sailed out of the ordinary world, the world of real towns and known coastlines, and other Greek ships all pointed home and into a stranger kind of place entirely, where the islands hold things that ought not to exist, and the plain rules of the sea no longer keep a careful man safe. Behind them, the last familiar headland slipped under the water and was gone. Ahead of them lay nothing but open sea, and whatever was waiting on the far side of it, and back on Ithaca, a young woman went on watching an empty stretch of horizon for a single sail. A sail that, with every one of those 9 long days, was being carried further and further away from her. After 9 days and nights of that wind, the land of the Lotus-Eaters must have looked like pure mercy. The storm set the ships down at last on a soft green shore, and the men, half drowned and worn to nothing, dragged the hulls up onto the sand and drank their fill of fresh water. And Odysseus, careful as always, sent a small party inland to find out what kind of people lived here, whether they were wild or friendly, whether a stranger could expect a welcome. It seemed, at first, like the gentlest place in all the world. The people who lived there meant no harm at all. They were not warriors, they carried no weapons, they lived quietly on the fruit of a single plant, a flower called the lotus, and when Odysseus's men came wandering among them, they shared it, the way you might offer a tired traveller a place at your table. And that was the whole trap, though there was no cruelty in it anywhere, because the moment a man tasted the lotus, something inside him quietly let go. It was not a poison, it caused no pain. It simply took away, softly and completely, any wish to go home. The men who ate it forgot the ships, they forgot Ithaca. They forgot the wives and the children they had been aching toward for 10 years of war. They wanted only to stay there on that shore, eating the sweet fruit and forgetting for the rest of their lives. When they did not come back, Odysseus went after them himself, and he found them content and smiling and utterly unwilling to leave. So he took them by force. He dragged them back down to the sea while they wept not from any hurt, but from being pulled away from the thing that had taken all their hurt away, and he tied them down under the rowing benches so they could not swim back to shore. Then he ordered every other man aboard at once, before a single one of them could take a single bite, and they rowed away hard. I want you to notice what the very first real danger of this long journey turned out to be, because it is not the kind of thing you would expect. It was not a monster, and it was not a storm. It was forgetting. It was the sweet, painless temptation to simply stop wanting to go home. And that same temptation is going to come back to Odysseus over and over, in far more beautiful and far more dangerous shapes, all the way to the goddess on the island where we began tonight, the one he wept in front of, the one who offered him the end of all his longing and all his suffering. The whole struggle of the Odyssey, underneath the monsters, is really this one quiet struggle to keep on wanting home, even when the world keeps offering you sweeter and sweeter reasons to let it go. And back on Ithaca, in these early years, home was still an easy thing to want and an easy thing to hope for. The long war was over. The ships of the other kings were coming in around the headlands, one by one. Penelope still had every reason to believe that one of those far-off sails would be his, any season now, and the boy Telemachus was still small enough to take his mother's certainty as plain and simple fact. In those days, the lamp in the high window was lit out of love, and not yet out of fear. No news, after all, is not the same thing as bad news. Not yet. But out on the stranger sea, the ships came next to a coast that would give this whole story its shape. It was the land of the Cyclops. Now, the Cyclops in these old tales were not clever craftsmen or forgers of thunderbolts. They were something older and simpler and worse Enormous, one-eyed giants who lived without a single one of the things that make people into people. They planted no crops and ploughed no fields. They just took whatever grew of its own accord. They held no councils and kept no laws. They had no ships, and no interest at all in the sea, or in trade, or even in one another. Each giant lived alone in his own cave, on his own hilltop, lording it over his own wife and children and caring nothing whatever for his neighbours. They were, in short, everything the Greek world defined itself against. No law, no gods honoured, and above all, no welcome for a stranger. And a stranger was exactly what was about to come knocking. Odysseus first brought his fleet to a small wooded island, lying just off the Cyclops shore, an empty island, thick with wild goats, that nobody lived on because the Cyclops had no boats to reach it. His men landed there in the dark, hunted the goats, and for the first time in a long while, ate until they were full, and they could so easily have simply stayed there, safe, and left the giants across the water well alone. But Odysseus could not do it. Along with all his cleverness, he carried one flaw that runs through this whole story like a crack through stone. He had to know. He wanted to see these Cyclops with his own eyes, to learn what kind of creatures they were, and if he was honest with himself, to find out whether they might give a visitor the gifts a proper host was supposed to give. So he left the bulk of his fleet safe at the island, and he took his own single ship and his own crew across to the mainland shore. And when he went up to explore, he picked 12 of his best men to come with him, and, almost as an afterthought, he slung over his shoulder that great skin of dark, strong wine the priest Maron had pressed on him back at Ismarus. That afterthought was about to save every life he had left. They found a huge cave near the shore, and they went inside it. No one was home, but everything in that cave told them that something very large lived there. There were pens full of lambs and kids, penned by age. There were baskets sagging with cheeses, and pails and bowls brimming with milk. It was the storehouse of an enormous, solitary herdsman. And Odysseus's men, who were nobody's fools, looked at all that food and had precisely the right idea. "Grab as many cheeses and as many animals as we can carry," they said. "Run them straight down to the ship and get away from here before whatever owns this cave comes home." They were completely, entirely correct. If Odysseus had only listened to them, this would have been a quick robbery and a clean escape, and the rest of tonight's story would be a far shorter and far happier tale. But he would not go. He wanted to meet the owner. He wanted to see the giant with his own eyes and be given a guest's welcome and a guest's gift. So they waited there in the cave, and that one choice cost the lives of 6 good men. When the giant came home, he came in like weather. His name was Polyphemus, and he was the size of a mountain crag, with a single great eye set in the middle of his forehead. He drove his flocks in through the mouth of the cave, and then he did the thing that turned that cave into a tomb. He lifted a boulder so vast that, the story tells us, 22 strong wagons could not have dragged it, and he set it over the entrance as easily as you or I would close a door. Now, there was no way out at all. He lit his fire, and by its light, he saw the men crouching against the walls. He asked them who they were, and what they wanted, and Odysseus answered him the way a civilized man answered anywhere in that world politely, and with a gentle reminder that travellers and strangers are under the protection of the gods, that Zeus himself watches over guests and punishes any host who mistreats them. It was the one rule that held the entire human world together, and Polyphemus simply laughed at it. "The Cyclops," he said, "care nothing for Zeus and nothing for any god above. They are stronger than the gods, and a Cyclops does exactly as he pleases." And then, without one more word, he reached out, took hold of 2 of the men, dashed them down against the stone, and ate them where he sat while the others watched, frozen, in the leaping firelight. When he had eaten his fill of human flesh, he stretched out among his sheep and went to sleep. Odysseus's first thought was the plain and obvious one: draw his sword and drive it into the sleeping giant's chest. But he stopped his own hand, and this is the exact cleverness that defines him. If he killed Polyphemus now, then all of them would die anyway, because not one of them, not every one of them straining together, could ever shift that boulder from the door. They would only be trapping themselves in a stone room with a rotting corpse. So instead he waited, and he thought, all through that long night, while the giant snored among his flocks. In the morning, Polyphemus ate 2 more of the men for his breakfast, drove his flocks out to pasture, and sealed the survivors in behind the great stone once more. And there in the dark, Odysseus made his plan. Lying in the cave was a long shaft of olive wood, green and huge, that the giant was seasoning to use one day as a walking staff. Odysseus and his men cut a length from it, and sharpened one end to a fine point, and hardened that point in the fire, and hid it away. And they drew lots to choose the 4 men who would help him do the thing he had now decided to do. That evening the giant came home again, and drove in his flock, and ate 2 more men. And now Odysseus stepped forward, holding out a deep bowl of the priest's dark wine, and offered it up to him sweetly, as though making peace. Polyphemus had never in his life tasted anything like it. He drank the bowl straight down and roared for more. Odysseus filled it again, and again 3 times over, and the strong, unwatered wine did to the giant exactly the work it was made for. As the warmth of it climbed into his head, Polyphemus grew almost friendly, and he asked his little guest to tell him his name, and promised him a guest gift in return. And Odysseus told him gravely that his name was Noman, nobody. "That is what my mother and my father call me," he said, "and that is what everyone calls me, nobody." "Well then," said the giant, laughing thickly, "here is my gift to you. Nobody, I will eat you last of all, after every one of your friends." And on that joke he toppled sideways, dead drunk, and fell into a deep sleep. They drew the stake from its hiding place, and turned its point in the embers until it glowed, and then all of them together lifted it and drove it down into the giant's one great eye, and leaned their whole weight upon it, and spun it, the way a man leans and spins a drill to bore through a ship's timber. Polyphemus woke with a scream that shook the whole mountain. He wrenched the burning stake out of his ruined eye and hurled it away into the dark, and then he lifted his voice and roared for his neighbours to come and help him. And the other Cyclops did come. They gathered in the night outside his blocked-up cave and called in to him through the stone. "What is wrong, Polyphemus? Why are you screaming? And waking us all is someone driving off your flocks. Is someone trying to kill you?" And from inside, in his agony, the blinded giant bellowed back the perfect, honest truth. "Nobody," he cried. "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is murdering me by trickery." And his neighbours, standing out there in the dark, heard exactly what Odysseus had built that lie to make them hear. "Well, if nobody is hurting you," they called back, "then you are alone in there, and this is some sickness the gods have sent, and there is nothing we can do about that. Say a prayer to your father Poseidon." And they all went back to their beds. And inside the cave, in the dark, over the sound of the giant weeping, Odysseus must have allowed himself a small and dangerous smile. His name, the little joke he had made of it, had just saved every man left alive in that cave. But they were still shut in. In the morning, the blind giant heaved the boulder aside to let his flocks out to graze, and then he lowered himself down into the open doorway and spread his enormous hands across the gap, feeling the back of every single sheep as it passed beneath him, certain he would catch the men trying to slip out among the animals. So Odysseus did the last clever thing. He lashed the giant's big rams together in 3s, and beneath the belly of the middle ram of each 3 he tied one of his men, hidden, buried in the deep wool. And for himself he kept back the greatest ram in the whole flock, and gripped its belly, and hung there upside down beneath it, his fingers locked in the fleece. And one by one the sheep filed out into the morning, and the blind giant ran his heavy hands across their thick backs, and felt nothing underneath at all, and let them go. That is how they escaped clinging to the undersides of the very animals the monster was counting to keep them in. They ran the sheep down to the ship, and drove them aboard, and pushed off, and pulled at the oars for their lives. And here, at the very edge of a clean and complete escape, Odysseus did the one thing he should never have done, the single thing that turns this from a story about outwitting a monster into the story of the next 10 years of his life. He could not hold his tongue. When the ship had gained a little water, he stood up and shouted back across it, jeering at the blinded giant, mocking him for what had been done to him. And Polyphemus, in his fury, tore the whole top off a mountain and flung it toward the sound of that voice. It crashed into the sea, just short of the bow, and the wave it threw up nearly drove the ship back onto the shore. The men hauled desperately at the oars and begged Odysseus to stop, to say no more, to leave the giant be. And he would not. His pride was up now, and there was no getting it back down. He stood a second time, and he threw away the one thing that had kept them all alive, his lie. "If anyone ever asks you who put out your eye," he shouted across the water, "tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who makes his home on Ithaca. He had given the monster his true name, and with his name he handed the monster the power to curse him properly. Because Polyphemus lifted his blind and ruined face to the sky and prayed to his own father, and his father was Poseidon, god of the sea, lord of the very element that Odysseus still had to cross the whole width of to reach his home. Grant, the giant prayed, that this Odysseus never reaches his home at all. But if he is truly fated to reach it, then let him come home late, and broken, and completely alone, having lost every last one of his companions, along the way carried home in a stranger's ship, and let him find nothing but trouble waiting for him in his own house. Listen to that curse one more time, slowly, because it is not merely rage shouted after a fleeing ship. It is the blueprint of everything that is left of tonight's story. Home late, home alone, every companion lost, carried the final stretch in a stranger's ship, and trouble waiting in the house. That is, very nearly word for word, exactly what is going to happen to him, because the god of the sea heard his son and bowed his head and granted it. The poem warned you in its opening breath that all of Odysseus's men would die, and that he alone would come home. This, here, on this dark water off the Cyclops shore, is the moment that fate clicks shut around him like a lock. He had blinded the sun. Now the father had the whole of the sea to work with, and all the time in the world to do it. Polyphemus flung one last mountain after the ship, and missed. And at last the little vessel ran on out of his reach, and came back to the goat island where the rest of the fleet lay waiting. They landed, and shared out the giant sheep among the crews, and tried to burn an offering of thanks to the gods for their escape, but the story tells us the offering was not accepted, and no god answered it. There was nothing left to do but grieve the 6 friends eaten in the cave, and sleep one more night on that shore, and go on. So they sailed on in the morning, a little fewer, and a good deal quieter, carrying with them now an enemy far greater than any single giant, the sea itself, and the god who ruled it, from this night on always listening for them. And the next island they came to belonged to a king who kept all the winds of the world shut up in a bag. The home of Aeolus was, for a little while, the happiest stop of the whole long voyage. Aeolus was the keeper of the winds, a king whom the gods had made, the warden of every wind that blows across the world, and he lived with his large family on a floating island, ringed by a wall of bronze, feasting, and at peace, untouched by any of the troubles of the sea. He took Odysseus in, and treated him kindly, and for a whole month he sat and listened, fascinated, to the story of Troy and everything that had happened since. And when Odysseus at last asked for help getting home, Aeolus gave him a gift worth more than gold. He took a great bag, made from the whole hide of an ox, and into it he bound up every wind that could possibly blow a ship off her course, all the storms, all the wrong directions, and he tied it shut with a bright silver cord, and stowed it deep in Odysseus's ship. Then he called up one single gentle wind, the west wind, to blow them straight home, and sent them on their way. It was, quite simply, a clear and open road to Ithaca. All Odysseus had to do, to reach his home, was nothing at all. For 9 days and 9 nights they ran before that good wind, and it never once failed them, and Odysseus would let no other hand touch the steering. He held the ship himself the entire way, trusting no one, watching the water. And on the 10th day, it happened. Land lifted up over the edge of the sea ahead of them, their own land, Ithaca. They came so close that they could see the people moving about on the shore, could make out the little watchfires burning on the hillsides of home. After 10 years of war, and all these months of horror since, home was right there in front of them, close enough to see the smoke going up from it. And that was the exact moment when Odysseus, who had not slept in 9 days and 9 nights, finally could not hold his eyes open one moment longer. He fell asleep at the steering oar, with his home in plain and open sight, and his men, watching their captain sleep, began to whisper among themselves. They looked at that fat ox-hide bag, tied shut with its silver cord, the bag he had guarded so closely the whole way, and would let no one near, and they decided, among themselves, that it had to be full of treasure. Gold and silver, they muttered, that Aeolus had heaped on him in secret, that he meant to carry home for himself, while the rest of them came back with empty hands. Their jealousy got the better of them completely. And so, while their captain slept, with the fires of his own island burning right there on the horizon, they loosened the silver cord and opened the bag just to see what they were owed. Every wind in the world burst out of it at once. The storm rose in a single heartbeat and seized the ship and flung it back out to sea, away from that shore, away from those fires, back the way they had so painfully come. And Odysseus woke to find his home already sinking under the horizon behind him, and his own men, the ones who had done it. In the end, the winds blew them all the way back to the island of Aeolus, and Odysseus climbed back up to that bronze-walled hall and stood before the king and begged him for the gift a second time. But Aeolus would not give it. "Get off my island," he said, "get out, and be quick about it. A man so plainly hated by the gods as you are is not a man I dare to help." And he drove them from his door. Sit for a moment with that one, because it may be the cruelest single thing that happens in this entire story. Not the men eaten by the giant in the cave. This. To cross the whole width of the world, to come close enough to see the smoke of your own chimneys, close enough to count the people standing on your own beach, and then to lose every mile of it, in your sleep, to the greed of the very men you were breaking yourself to carry home. Home had been right there, and now it slid back over the edge of the world, and years further away, with the winds gone, and no god now willing to send another, there was nothing left to do but row. For 6 days they rowed, and on the 7th they came into a strange harbour in the land of a people called the Laestrygonians, a deep, still harbour, almost entirely closed in by cliffs, with only a narrow gap to enter through. It looked like perfect shelter. 11 of the 12 ships rowed gratefully in through that gap and tied up close together in the calm water inside. But Odysseus, careful as he always was, did not trust a harbour that had only one way out. He moored his own ship alone, outside the mouth of it, against the open sea. That one caution saved his life, and only his, because the Laestrygonians were giants too, and they were cannibals. When Odysseus's scouts went up toward the town, they met the king's daughter, tall as a growing tree, and behind her the queen, a horror the size of a hill. And then the king himself came roaring out and snatched up one of the men to eat him where he stood. The others ran, but it was already far too late. The giants came swarming to the cliff tops all around that closed-in harbour, and they began to hurl down boulders, enormous stones, onto the trapped ships below. They smashed the hulls to splinters. And then they waded out into their own harbour and speared the drowning men in the water like fish and carried them off home to eat. 11 ships, 11 whole crews, hundreds of men, all of it in a few screaming minutes, in a harbour that had looked like safety itself. Only Odysseus's single ship, moored outside the gap, tore itself free and got away because he cut the mooring line with his own sword and screamed at his men to row, and they pulled out across the open water while their friends died behind them. He had set out from the ruins of Troy with 12 ships. Now he had one. Everyone else was gone. And it is worth sitting for a moment with what actually saved that one ship, because the poem quietly insists on it. Not strength, not luck, and certainly not the favour of any god. A decision. A single year of catastrophe had taught Odysseus one hard rule, that a perfect thing offered to exhausted men is almost always a trap, and so he had looked at a perfect, sheltered harbour and refused it on no evidence at all. The very same captain who once let himself fall asleep within sight of home does not fall asleep here, and the whole distance between those two versions of one man is 11 ships, and every soul aboard them. That one ship, grieving and half-wrecked, came next to an island called Aea, and here the danger wore a far gentler face. They rested there 2 days, worn down to nothing at all. On the 3rd, Odysseus climbed a hill to look over the land, and saw smoke rising from a house deep in the woods. He was not fool enough, after everything, to march his whole remaining crew straight in. He split them, and sent half 22 men, under a man named Eurylochus, to go and find out who lived there, while he waited behind with the rest. The house in the woods belonged to a goddess named Circe, a witch, and around her door there prowled lions and wolves that did not attack the men, but fawned on them, and wagged, and leaned against them like tame dogs. They were, though the men did not understand it yet, the visitors who had come before. Circe came out, lovely and smiling and full of welcome, and drew the men inside, and set a warm meal in front of them and stirred a drug into it. The moment they had eaten, she struck them with her wand, and they became swine. Pigs with the bodies and the grunting of pigs, and, most cruelly of all, the minds of men still trapped and awake inside them. understanding exactly what had been done. She drove them, weeping in their pig throats, into a sty, and threw down acorns for them to eat. Only Eurylochus, who had hung back at the door suspecting a trap, escaped and ran the whole way back to tell Odysseus that half of the last men in the world were simply gone. So Odysseus took up his sword and his bow and went alone to get them back with no plan at all, only a flat refusal to leave his men behind. And on the forest path, the god Hermes met him and took pity on him and gave him two things. First, a herb, a small plant the gods call moly, black at the root and white at the flower, that would make Circe's drug useless against him. And second, the plan itself. "Eat with her," Hermes said. "Let her strike you with the wand, and when the magic does nothing, and she stands there staring at you in shock, draw your sword and rush at her as though you mean to kill her. She will be terrified, and she will try to make peace but agree to nothing at all, until she has sworn a great and binding oath by the gods to do you no further harm." And it went exactly as the god had said. The drug did nothing, the wand did nothing. Odysseus drew his sword. Circe, astonished, gave way at once, and she swore the oath. Then she turned his men back from swine into men again, taller, younger, handsomer than they had been before, and she welcomed the whole crew into her house as honoured guests. And there they stayed. Not for a night, for a whole year. Circe's island was comfortable and safe and rich, and after everything they had lived through, the men were in no hurry whatsoever to leave it. This is the temptation of the lotus once again, wearing a warmer and more human face, the pull to simply stop and rest, and let home quietly become a thing you used to want. A full year slipped past them before the men themselves finally came to Odysseus and reminded him, gently, that there was still such a place as Ithaca, and that it was surely time to go, and Odysseus agreed. But when he asked Circe to send them on their way, she told him that there was one journey he had to make first, and it was the last journey any living man would ever choose. Before he could go home to the living, he first had to sail to the land of the dead. She told him how it was done. He was to sail to the very edge of the world, to a place of endless fog and darkness where the sun never shines at all, and there, at the doorway of the underworld, work a rite to call the spirits of the dead up into the light, because there was one dead man he needed to speak with, not a friend. A prophet, the blind seer Tiresias, who even in death had kept his wisdom whole, and who alone could tell Odysseus the way home. So they sailed to that dark shore, and Odysseus dug a pit, and poured out offerings around it, and cut the throats of sacrificial sheep, so that the dark blood ran down into the earth. And drawn by that blood, the dead came up out of the ground, a great crowd of them, whispering, thin as smoke, young brides and worn-out old men and boys and warriors still wearing the wounds that had killed them. And it took everything Odysseus had in him not to turn and run. The first spirit to reach him was not the prophet at all. It was Elpenor, one of his own crew, a young man who had drunk too much on Circe's roof, fallen asleep up there, and broken his neck in the fall on the very morning they sailed. So suddenly that they had left without ever knowing he was dead. His body still lay unburied on the island behind them, and his ghost begged Odysseus, by everyone he had ever loved, to sail back and burn his body properly and raise him a grave, so that he could rest. It is a small, aching, human moment in the middle of all that dark, the newest and loneliest ghost of all, asking only not to be forgotten. Then Tiresias came and told him the truth of it. "You can still reach home," the prophet said, "but the sea god is set against you for the blinding of his son, and he will make the road bitter. And here is the thing above all others that you must hold to. On your way, you will come to an island where the sun god keeps his cattle grazing. Whatever else you do, do not lay a hand on those cattle. Leave them be, and though you will suffer for it, you and your men may still come home to Ithaca together. But harm them, kill so much as one, and I promise you this: your ship will be destroyed, and your men will all die, and you yourself will come home late, and alone, and broken, on a ship that belongs to strangers, to find your own house full of insolent men devouring your wealth and courting your wife." Listen to how exactly that matches the curse, the blinded Cyclops screamed across the water after his ship. Two voices now, a monster and a prophet, have told Odysseus the very same future. And all of it, the prophet said, all of it turns on a single act of restraint, from a crew that has not once, in this entire voyage, managed to restrain itself. And then, among the crowd of the dead, Odysseus saw his own mother. He had not known that she had died. He had left her alive and well when he sailed for Troy. Her name was Anticlea, and her ghost drifted to the blood, and knew her son, and asked him how he came to be in the country of the dead while he was still breathing. And then she told him about home, the news he had been starving for through 10 long years. His wife Penelope was still there, she said, still faithful, still waiting, weeping away her nights and her days for a husband who never came. His son Telemachus was growing toward manhood, and his old father Laertes had left the town altogether and gone to live alone out on the farm, in rags, sleeping in the ashes by the fire through the winter, grieving himself slowly to death for a son he was certain was lost. And she herself, his own mother, had died of nothing in the world but that same grief, not of any sickness, of missing him. 3 times Odysseus stepped forward to take her in his arms, and 3 times she slipped straight through them, like a shadow, like a dream, because a shadow and a dream are all that the dead are. He could see her, and hear her, and love her, and he could not hold her for one instant. There were others still. Agamemnon came, the great king who had led the whole Greek army to Troy, and won the war, and sailed home at last in triumph. And his was the most terrible warning of them all, because Agamemnon had already done the one thing Odysseus was killing himself to do. He had gotten home, he had walked back in through his own front door, and there, at his own welcome home feast, his wife and the man she had taken up with in his absence had cut him down like an ox at the trough, him and all his men with him. "Guard yourself," Agamemnon's ghost told Odysseus. "Come home in secret, not out in the open. Trust no welcome until you are certain of it. The homecoming you are wearing yourself to nothing to reach can turn out to be the deadliest ground of all. It is the dark twin of Odysseus's own story, the faithless wife set against the faithful one, the murdering welcome against the one still keeping a lamp lit, and Odysseus would remember every single word of it. And then Achilles came, the greatest fighter who ever lived, the champion of the whole war, dead young at Troy exactly as he had always known he would be, traded away for glory that would last forever. Odysseus tried to comfort him. "Surely," he said, "a man like you rules as a prince even here among the dead. Surely you, of all men, have nothing to mourn." And Achilles gave him back the answer that has carried down for 3,000 years. "Do not stand there and make death sound sweet to me," he said. "I would rather be a living man, a poor one, a man with no land of his own, hiring myself out to break my back for some other poor farmer up in the sunlight, than be king over all the breathless dead. All that glory," and this is what the greatest of them had to say about it in the end, that he would trade every last scrap of it for one more ordinary day above the ground. Then he asked, almost shyly, whether his young son had grown up brave and good, and when Odysseus told him yes, that his boy had been a hero at Troy, the ghost of Achilles turned and strode away across the field of the dead with great glad steps, content at least in that one thing. More and more of the dead came pressing in toward the blood, whispering, until the sheer weight of them frightened even Odysseus, and he turned and ran for his ship, and cast off and fled that grey shore for the light of the living world. They sailed back to Circe's island one last time, and they kept their word to the loneliest ghost of all they found, Elpenor's body, and burned it, and raised a mound over it, and stood his oar upright on the top, to mark the grave of a man who never did get to go home. And Circe, who knew the road ahead better than anyone alive, sat Odysseus down and told him, plainly and carefully, about the horrors still waiting between her island and his own. There were 3 of them, and the first, she said, would not roar, or throw stones, or turn men into swine. The first one would sing. The song of the Sirens was the first of the 3 horrors Circe had warned him about, and it was, in its own way, the strangest of them because it did not kill with teeth, or stones, or storms. It killed with beauty. The Sirens were 2 creatures who sat in a flowered meadow on the shore of their island, and sang, and their singing was so unbearably lovely that any sailor who heard it swung his ship toward the sound and drove it straight onto the rocks and died there. The meadow all around them, Circe said, was heaped pale with the bones of the men who had gone before, rotting in their skins. And the truly dangerous thing about the Sirens was not only that their song was beautiful, it was what they sang. They did not sing nonsense. They sang knowledge. They promised that any man who paused to listen would sail away wiser than he came, that they knew everything. all that had happened at Troy, all that happens anywhere on the wide earth, and all that is still to come. To a man like Odysseus, whose one great weakness was that he always had to know, that was the most dangerous bait in the world. Circe's instructions were exact, and Odysseus followed them to the letter. He took a great round of beeswax and worked it soft in his hands, and stopped up the ears of every man in the crew, so that not one of them could catch a single note. But he could not bear to pass the Sirens and not hear that song for himself, of course he could not. So he had his men leave his own ears open and bind him upright against the mast, hand and foot, with hard knots. And he ordered them, before he could hear anything at all, that whatever he did afterward, however he begged or struggled or screamed at them to release him, they were to ignore him utterly, and that if he fought the ropes, they were to come and tie him tighter still. And so Odysseus became the only man ever to hear the song of the Sirens and live to tell of it. As the ship came up on their island, the wind died away to nothing, and a strange dead calm settled over the whole sea, as though the water itself were holding its breath to listen. The men furled the useless sail and bent their backs to the oars. When the ship drew within range, the two of them lifted their voices and sang to him, by his own name, sang that they knew all his glory at Troy, that they could tell him everything, that he had only to stop and listen, and it undid him completely. He strained against the ropes with all his strength, and he shouted at his men to turn the ship, to cut him loose, his whole face begging them, but they could hear nothing at all. They saw only their captain thrashing and pleading against the mast, and they did exactly what he had told them to do. Two of them rose and bound him tighter, and they rowed and rowed, until the island and its song fell away behind them, and the danger was past. And only then did they dig the wax out of their own ears and set him free. There is a hard kind of wisdom in what he did there, and it is the wisdom of a man who has finally learned not to trust himself. He knew that when the song came, he would want, with his whole heart, to steer his ship onto the rocks, and so he arranged, while he was still clear-headed, to be saved from the man he was about to become. He bound his own hands before the temptation could ever reach them. It is the exact opposite of what his crew keep doing to themselves, over and over, and it is a large part of why he is the one who lives. But Circe had told him that the Sirens were the gentle part. Ahead lay a narrow strait, and for this one there was no clever trick, no wax and no rope, only a choice between two deaths, and the discipline to take the smaller. On the two sides of that strait crouched two monsters. On the one side, beneath a wild fig tree on a low rock, lived a thing called Charybdis, who 3 times a day sucked the entire sea down into her throat, and 3 times a day heaved it back up, in a black roaring whirlpool that would swallow any ship that came near it whole, and leave nothing behind, not a plank. And on the other side, high up in a cliff, in a cave that no man could ever climb to, lived a monster called Scylla, a horror with 6 long necks, and on the end of each neck a hideous head, and in each head 3 rows of teeth, yelping forever like a pack of dogs. When a ship passed below her, Scylla shot all 6 of those heads down at once, and plucked 6 men off the deck in a single motion, 1 man screaming in each mouth, and drew them up to her cave to be eaten alive. And here was the cruelty of the Strait. You could not avoid them both. To steer wide of the whirlpool that would take the whole ship and every soul in it, you had to pass close under the cliff of the monster who would take 6. Circe's advice had been as hard as iron. Do not even think of fighting Scylla. She had said you cannot kill her, and if you stop to try, she will only lean down and take 6 more. Row past her as fast as your men can pull, grieve the 6 you lose, and thank the gods it was not the whole ship. It was the coldest arithmetic in the entire story. 6 men, chosen by nobody, spent to buy the lives of all the rest. Odysseus did as she said very nearly. He could not quite bring himself to warn his crew about Scylla beforehand. He was afraid that if they knew what waited above them, they would drop the oars in terror and hide below deck, and then the ship would drift, and every man would die. So he told them only about the whirlpool, and kept the 6-headed thing to himself, and he strapped on his armour, and took up 2 spears, and stood on the deck watching the cliff, hoping, against Circe's warning, to somehow fight the monster off. But Scylla struck far too fast to fight. As they hauled at the oars to stay clear of the sucking whirlpool on the other side, she came down out of her cave, and in one motion took 6 men, the 6 strongest rowers on the ship, and lifted them up into the air. Odysseus said afterward that of every terrible thing he witnessed in all his years of wandering, this was the most pitiful. his own men, held high against the cliff face, stretching their hands down toward him and calling out his name, one last time apiece as they were carried up to that cave. And there was nothing in the world that he could do but keep his men rowing and leave the others to their screams, and save the ones who were left. And while the sea was taking his men from him one handful at a time, the island he was dying to reach was quietly changing without him. On Ithaca the years were piling up now, and hope had begun to wear dangerously thin. The other kings had all come home long ago, or were known for certain to be dead. Only Odysseus had simply vanished, no word, no body, no grave, nothing. And into that silence the young men of Ithaca and the islands around it began to come to his house. First a few of them, then more, then a whole crowd, because a queen with no husband and no proof of a husband's death was a great prize, and his kingdom was a great prize, and sooner or later someone was going to take them both. They moved into his hall. They ate his herds and drank down his wine and pressed Penelope, day after day after day, to choose one of them and be done with it. And she, every bit as clever as the man she was waiting for, began to buy herself time in the only way she had left. But that is a thread we will take up properly a little further on. For now, hold on to only this. The longer Odysseus stayed lost out on the sea, the less safe his home became, so that the sea and the house had begun to work against him at the very same time, from opposite ends of the world. The Strait was behind them now, and the ship, lighter by 6 good men, came at last to the one island the prophet had warned him about above all others, Thrinacia, where the sun god kept his cattle grazing. Odysseus remembered the warning perfectly. Both the ghost of the prophet Tiresias, down in the land of the dead, and the goddess Circe, on her bright island, had told him the very same thing in the very same words: do not touch those cattle. And so, as they came up on the island and heard the lowing of the herds and the bleating of the flocks drifting out across the water, Odysseus told his men the plain truth that they had been warned twice over by a prophet and by a goddess to sail straight past this place and never set foot on it. But his men were finished. They were starving and worn to the bone, and the man leading them, Eurylochus, turned on Odysseus and said the thing that exhausted men always say: "You must be made of iron. You never seem to need rest. But the rest of us are only flesh and blood, and we will not row on through the night past a safe shore for the sake of a prophecy. Let us land, and eat, and sleep one single night, and go on at dawn." And Odysseus could not force one man to row on against the will of all the others. So he gave way, but not before he made every last one of them swear a solemn oath that they would eat only the food Circe had sent with them, and would not lay so much as a finger on a single one of the sun god's cattle. They swore it gladly, and they landed, and they ate their own provisions, and for that one night all was well. And then the trap closed on them. A wind came up out of the south, and simply would not stop day after day after day, a whole month of it, and pinned the ship to that shore, with no way to leave. And in that month the food Circe had given them ran out. They fished, and they snared what birds they could, but it was never enough, and slowly the men began to starve walking past those fat, sacred, forbidden cattle every single day with their stomachs knotting. You can feel where this has to go. It was only a question of time, and the gods, who meant to see these men punished, arranged the timing themselves. One day Odysseus went off alone into the hills to find a quiet place to pray for deliverance, and the gods answered his prayer by pouring sleep over him, so that he was nowhere near, at the one moment when his being there might have stopped what came next. While he slept, Eurylochus made his case to the starving men, and it was a horribly reasonable case. "Every kind of death is hateful," he said, "but the most pitiful death of all is to starve to nothing. These are the sun god's cattle, true, so let us take the best of them and sacrifice them properly to the gods. And if the sun god is enraged and wants to sink our ship over it, then so be it. I would far rather die all at once, drowning in the open sea, than sit on this beach and waste slowly away to a skeleton." And to starving men, that sounded exactly like wisdom. So they rounded up the finest of the cattle, and killed them, and set them roasting. And when Odysseus woke, and came back down toward the shore, the smell of roasting beef reached him on the wind, and in that instant he knew that his men were already dead. Every one of them, that they simply had not fallen down yet. The signs were ghastly. The gods made the flayed hides crawl along the ground, and the meat on the spits lowed like living cattle even as it cooked. And word of the slaughter reached the sun god almost at once. One of his own people carried the news up to him, and he rose before the whole assembly of the gods in a cold fury and demanded that the men who had killed his cattle be made to pay. If they were not punished, he swore he would take his light down into the house of the dead and shine among the ghosts and leave the living world in darkness. And Zeus, to keep the sun where it belonged, gave him his answer. It will be done. I will strike their ship with a thunderbolt out on the open sea and shatter it to pieces. So the sentence was passed on the feasting men while they still had the meat in their hands. They were the walking dead already. The sea was only waiting for them to leave the shore. For 6 days the doomed men feasted anyway, because there was nothing left to do now but eat. And on the 7th day, the endless south wind finally dropped, and they ran the ship down into the water and sailed. And that was the end of them. The moment the island sank out of sight astern, and there was nothing but open water on every side, the sky turned black. Zeus sent a single thunderbolt straight down into the ship, and it burst apart where it floated. The mast came crashing down. The men were flung into the sea, and one after another they were swept off and drowned. Every last one of them exactly as the prophet had sworn they would be, exactly as their own recklessness had earned. The poem told you this would happen in its opening lines, before you had learned a single name, that his companions perished through their own folly in the eating of the cattle of the Sunday. Here, on this black water, is where the last of them did. Only Odysseus was left alive. He lashed together the mast and the keel of his shattered ship, and clung to them as the storm carried him back of all the directions in the whole world, back toward the Strait, back toward the whirlpool of Charybdis. He reached it just as it was sucking the entire sea down into itself, his little raft along with it, and he saved himself only by springing up and catching hold of the branches of the wild fig tree that overhung the pit, and hanging there, above the roaring emptiness, clinging like a bat to a wall, for hour after hour, until at last Charybdis heaved his raft back up out of the deep, and he dropped down onto it, and paddled with his bare hands, and got clear. For 9 days he drifted alone on that wreckage across an empty sea, no ship, no crew, no food, no notion of where in the world. He was the one living man left of the 12 ships that had sailed out of the ruins of Troy. Think back, for a moment, to what the blinded giant had screamed across the water, and what the prophet had promised him among the dead, late, alone. Every companion lost. It had all come true now, to the letter, out here on this open water, with no one left to hear it. And on the 10th night, the sea carried him, half dead, up onto the shore of an island. It was a green and lonely island, far off every sea road that men knew, and on it there lived a beautiful goddess, entirely alone, who would take him in, and heal him, and love him, and want to keep him there with her forever. The island of Calypso was, by any ordinary measure, the most beautiful place Odysseus ever came to, and it became the hardest prison of them all. The goddess who lived there was named Calypso, and when she found him washed up half drowned on her shore, the last living man of all the ships that had sailed from Troy, she took him in and cared for him, and, in time, came to love him. She wanted him to stay, and she was not offering him a cave and a hard life in exchange. She was offering him herself, a goddess, forever, and more than that. She offered to make him like her. She offered him immortality. She promised that if he would only remain with her and be her husband, she would make him deathless and ageless for all time to come, so that he would never grow old, and never die, and never suffer anything ever again, on that green island at the still centre of the sea. Stop and weigh that offer honestly, because it is the offer at the very heart of this whole story. Everything Odysseus had been battling the sea to win safety, rest, an end to his suffering. Calypso was holding out to him in her open hand, and a great deal more besides. No more storms, no more drowning friends, no more grief of any kind, not even death itself, waiting at the end. All he had to do, to have all of it, was let go of one single thing. He had to let go of home, and he would not do it. For 7 years, he would not do it. And you should see the place he was refusing, to understand what that refusal cost him. Calypso's island was a garden at the far edge of the world. Her cave was warm and sweet with the smoke of a cedar fire that burned there night and day, and she sang to herself in a lovely voice as she worked back and forth at her loom. A great vine, heavy and dark with ripe grapes, climbed across the whole mouth of the cave. 4 clear springs rose close together nearby and ran off in 4 directions through soft meadows thick with wild violets and parsley. Alders and black poplars and tall, sweet-smelling cypress stood all around, and in their branches roosted owls and hawks and long-tongued sea crows that make their living off the water. The poem says that even a god, coming upon that island by chance, would stop and stare, and feel his heart lift at the sheer beauty of it. That was the place. That was the paradise Odysseus sat in the very middle of, day after day, with his back turned to every bit of it, staring out at the empty water and weeping to go home. Here is what those 7 years actually looked like, and it is one of the quietest and saddest pictures in all of the old poetry. Every single day, Odysseus rose and walked down to the edge of the sea, and sat himself down on the rocks there, and looked out over the empty water toward a home he had no way to reach and wept. He wept until he had no tears left in him, and then he simply sat and stared, and his life leaked out of him like water into sand. At night he went back up to the goddess's cave, because there was nowhere else on the island to go, and he lay down beside her, but the poem is careful and honest about this. He did it because he had to now, and no longer because he wished to. His body was on the island, his whole heart was out on the sea road home. He had a goddess who loved him, and an open offer of endless life, and he spent his days crying on a beach for a poor rocky island and a mortal aging woman, a whole world away. And that is the answer this story gives to the largest question it knows how to ask. What is a home worth? It is worth more than never dying. Calypso even put it to him plainly, near the end of it. "How can you still want to leave," she asked him, "when I can give you this, when your Penelope is only a mortal woman who will grow old and wither and die, and I am a goddess, and more beautiful than she is, and you know that I am?" And Odysseus did not argue with a word of it. He agreed with all of it. "Yes," he said, "you are a goddess, and she is only a woman, and she will age and die, and you never will. I know it. And even so, every day of my life, the one thing I want is to go home, and to live to see the day I get there." He would rather grow old and die in his own house, beside his own aging wife, than live forever, young and safe and untouched, in the arms of a goddess in paradise. That is the choice at the dead centre of the Odyssey, and he made it the same way, quietly, on the rocks, every single day, for 7 years. Think, too, about how strange and how cruel that particular kind of captivity is. If Calypso had thrown him in a dungeon and chained him to a wall, he would at least have had something to fight, something to hate, something to break out of. But she chained him with kindness and comfort and love and endless ease, and there is no wall to climb out of that and no lock to pick. It is the very same danger as the lotus flower, and the very same danger as Circe's comfortable year, come back one final time and grown enormous. The danger that a man, offered enough softness for long enough, will simply stop wanting the hard thing that he loves. 7 years is a very long time to go on wanting something you cannot have. Most people, given 7 years of that, would let the wanting quietly die and settle and call the settling wisdom. The astonishing thing about Odysseus, the thing that makes him worth a story 3,000 years long, is that he never once let it die. Every morning the wanting was still there, as sharp as it had been on the first day, and every morning he carried it back down to the rocks and sat with it and wept. But he was not the only one refusing to let go of that home. Turn now, back across all that water, to Ithaca, because his wife was fighting the very same battle from the other side of it and slowly losing ground. By this time, the situation inside his house had gone from bad to unbearable. The young men who had come courting Penelope were no longer a handful of hopefuls. There were 108 of them now, princes and lords' sons from Ithaca and every island around it, and they had simply moved in. Understand what that meant. In a world built on the sacred bond between a host and a guest, the same bond that Paris had shattered to begin the whole war, these men had turned that bond completely inside out. They were guests who had made themselves into a plague. Day after day they sat in another man's hall, and slaughtered another man's cattle and pigs and sheep, and drank down another man's wine, and ordered around another man's servants, and demanded that another man's wife choose one of them and marry him, all while that man was, for all any of them knew, either dead at the bottom of the sea, or on his way home at that very moment to find them there. They were eating the whole household down to the bare walls and doing it on purpose, gambling that sooner or later they would starve the queen out or wear her down into surrender. If you had walked into that hall on any ordinary afternoon, this is what you would have seen. The suitors sprawled everywhere across the seats and across the hides of the very oxen they had killed and eaten, throwing dice and playing at draughts and shouting for more wine. Servants, Odysseus's own servants, hurrying between them with baskets of bread and platters of meat and great bowls of mixed wine, because these men had taken over the running of the household as if it already belonged to them. And in a corner, a singer named Phaeacians, a decent and gentle man, made to stand and sing for them whether he wanted to or not, so that there was music laid over the whole ugly scene, evening after evening, in a house whose true master might already be lying dead at the bottom of the sea. This had been going on not for weeks, and not for months, but for years. It was simply what the house had become, and there was almost no one left to stop them. Odysseus's father, old Laertes, had given up and gone off to grieve alone on his farm, and Odysseus's son, Telemachus, the baby who had been in Penelope's arms on the morning the ships sailed away, had grown up through all these years into a young man in a house full of grown men who openly despised him, watching his own inheritance devoured in front of his face, old enough now to burn with the shame of it, and still far too young and far too alone to do a single thing about it. He would sit among them, the poem says, and picture his father walking back in through the door and scattering them all like frightened birds. And then he would look up, and there would be no one standing in the doorway, and the suitors would be laughing, and the daydream would quietly go out. So Penelope did the only thing left that she could do. She could not fight 108 armed men. She could not throw them out of the house. She could not prove her husband alive, and she could not make herself believe him dead. What she could do was buy time. And she bought it with the cleverest and most patient trick in the whole story. A trick every bit the equal of anything her missing husband ever devised out on the water. She went to the suitors, and she told them, in so many words, yes, she would choose a new husband, but not quite yet. First, she said, there was a sacred duty she had to see finished. Her husband's father, old Laertes, was nearing the end of his life, and it would be a lasting shame before every woman in the land if a man so great were laid in the ground without a fine burial shroud to be buried in. Only let her finish weaving that shroud, she said, and the moment it was done, she would marry. It was a request that no one could refuse without looking like a monster, a faithful woman weaving a deathcloth for her husband's dying father. So the suitors agreed to wait and settled back down to their endless feasting. And every day, up in the great room, Penelope sat at her loom and wove that shroud, wide and beautiful, in plain view of the whole household. And every night, in secret, by torchlight, once the house had gone to sleep, she unpicked the entire day's work, thread by thread, and quietly undid it, so that the shroud was forever being woven and never, ever got finished. Sit for a moment with the image of that, because it is the very heart of her side of the story. A woman, alone in the dark, patiently unmaking her own work with her own hands, night after night, to keep from having to give up on a man the whole world had already buried. It is the exact same thing Odysseus is doing out on his beach, weeping at the sea, refusing, over and over and over, to accept the ending everyone else has long since accepted. The two of them, a whole ocean apart, are performing the identical act of stubborn, hopeless faithfulness. He unmakes a goddess's offer of paradise every single day. She unmakes her own weaving every single night. Neither one of them will let this story end the easy way. She kept it up for 3 whole years. For 3 years the trick held, and the shroud was never finished, and the suitors waited, and grumbled, and never once understood why. And then it came apart, the way these things nearly always do from the inside. One of her own serving women, who had taken up with the suitors, gave the secret away. And so one night the suitors came bursting in and caught her at it, unravelling by torchlight the very cloth they had watched her weaving that same day, and after that, the game was finished. They forced her to complete the shroud, and now she had no trick left, and no excuse left, and no more time left to buy. She was cornered in her own house. Whatever came next was going to have to come soon. And when the tricks were all used up, what was left underneath them was the grief she let no one see. In the daylight she was the queen composed, careful, giving nothing away. But the poem lets us into her nights, and they are hard to sit with. She would go up alone to her room and lie awake and weep for her husband until the goddess of sleep at last closed her eyes for her by force. She had reached the point where she prayed quietly, simply to die in her sleep and be spared what was coming to be gone before she had to go into the bed of a lesser man and hand her husband's house over to strangers. She lay awake up there like a bird singing by itself in the dark, turning the same hopeless question over and over through the night. Hold on a little longer for a man who is almost certainly bones on the seafloor, or give up now and let all of it end. That is what the unweaving of the shroud actually costs her. Underneath, it is not a clever little game to Penelope. It is the hardest thing a human being can be asked to do, to keep on hoping, deliberately, night after night, with every reason to stop. And so, in the 20th year, since a young king had sailed off to a war that was only ever supposed to last a season, both of these people had arrived at the very end of what a human being can bear. Out on his island, Odysseus had wept himself hollow and had refused, for the 10,000th time, to trade his home away for the gift of never dying, and was no closer to leaving than on the day the sea first spat him ashore, a prisoner of a kindness he had no way to break. And in his hall, Penelope had spent her last trick, and finished the shroud she had spun out for 3 years, and could feel the walls of that house drawing slowly in around her and her son. Both of them had held on with everything they had in them. Both of them were very nearly out of everything they had. They had stayed faithful to a home that neither one of them could reach, and for 19 long years, no one up in heaven had lifted so much as a finger to help them. But the 20th year had come around at last, and far above the weeping man, and far above the cornered woman, and far above the wide grey sea that lay between the two of them, the gods, at long last, began to turn their eyes back toward Ithaca. High on Olympus, in the house of Zeus, the gods were at their dinner, and the talk had turned, as it sometimes did, to how foolish mortals are, and how quick they are to blame heaven for troubles they bring down entirely on themselves. Zeus gave the example that was on his mind that evening. Aegisthus, the man who had stolen the wife of King Agamemnon while the king was away at war, and then murdered Agamemnon at his welcome home feast, and who had done it, even though the gods had sent Hermes ahead to warn him plainly that Agamemnon's young son, Orestes, would grow up and repay him for both crimes. Aegisthus had not listened, and now he was dead, exactly as foretold, cut down by that grown son. "There," said Zeus, "is how it nearly always goes. Men earn their own destruction, and then curse the gods for it. Remember that name, Orestes, the boy who avenged his murdered father. It is about to be held up to another young man as the example he must live up to." And in the middle of that talk, the goddess Athena, who had always loved Odysseus for his quick mind and had watched over him all through the war at Troy, decided that she had waited long enough. She spoke up to her father Zeus, and she pleaded the case of the one man who, out of all the Greek captains, still had not come home. "Think of Odysseus," she said. "He is not dead. He is something worse than dead. He is stranded alive on a lonely island in the middle of nowhere, weeping just to catch sight of the smoke of his own chimneys, while a goddess keeps him there against his will, and his own house is eaten alive by wolves. How much longer will you leave him there? Why are you so hard on him?" And Zeus answered that he had not forgotten Odysseus at all, that there was no cleverer or more generous man anywhere alive. The trouble, he said, was his own brother Poseidon, the god of the sea, who would not let go of his grudge over the blinding of his son the Cyclops, and who had turned the whole ocean into a wall standing between Odysseus and his home. But Poseidon happened to be away just then, off at the far edge of the world feasting among a distant people, and with the sea god's back turned, the rest of the gods could finally move. So they made their plan there at the table, and it had 2 halves, 2 errands, sent out to opposite ends of the world, that would slowly begin to draw this whole scattered story back together. Hermes, the messenger god, would go to Calypso's island and command her, in the name of Zeus, to let Odysseus go at last. And Athena herself would go down to Ithaca to the house full of wolves and put some fire into the heart of the one person there who might, if he could only grow up fast enough, help to save it, Odysseus' son. So Athena came down to Ithaca, disguised as an old friend of the family, a traveller passing through, and she walked into that hall. We have already spent too long in the suitors sprawled and gaming and bellowing for wine, the singer made to perform over the slow wreck of the house. And she found Telemachus sitting among them, wretched, doing the only thing he ever did, staring at the door and dreaming of a father who never walked through it. But this time, someone sat down beside him. And this stranger spoke to him the way no one had spoken to him in years, not as a boy to be pitied and pushed aside, but as a man, and a king's son, with a king's business to see to. "Do you understand whose son you are?" she asked him. "You have your father's very look about you. Your father is not dead. He is alive, held somewhere out on the sea, and he means to come home. But you cannot go on sitting here waiting for him while these men eat away your birthright in front of you. It is time to stop being a child. Tomorrow, call the men of Ithaca together in assembly, out in the open, and tell these suitors to their faces to get out of your house. And then take a ship and go to Pylos and to Sparta, and ask the old kings who fought beside your father whether they have any word of him at all. If you learn that he lives, then hold on 1 more year. And if you learn that he is dead, come home, bury him properly, give your mother to a new husband, and then find your way to be rid of these men the way young Orestes won the admiration of the whole world by avenging his own murdered father. You are not a child any longer, so stop behaving like one." And then she was gone, and as she went, she changed, and rose up and flew out of the hall like a bird, and Telemachus realized, with a jolt that ran right through him, that he had been sitting and talking with a god, and something in him that had been asleep his entire life woke up. For the first time, he was not just a sad boy in a corner of his father's ruined house. He was the son of Odysseus, and he had been handed a task. He moved fast, and he caught everyone off guard, the suitors most of all. That very night he spoke to his mother, with a new steadiness in his voice that stopped her where she stood. And the next morning he did a thing that had not been done on Ithaca in 20 years. He summoned the whole island to an assembly. He stood up in front of all of them, this boy they had all watched grow up, and he denounced the suitors out loud, in public, for what they were doing to his home, and he called on gods and men alike to witness it. The suitors were not frightened, exactly. They were irritated. Their ringleaders sneered at him, and put the blame on his own mother for stringing them along with tricks like the shroud, and flatly refused to leave. But something had shifted, and every man in that square could feel it. The boy had teeth now, and as the assembly broke up, Zeus sent a sign of his own. 2 eagles came sweeping down out of the sky, wheeling low over the crowd, tearing at each other with beak and talon right above their heads, before they veered off toward the houses of the town. An old man of Ithaca who knew how to read such things rose to his feet and told them plainly what it meant. Odysseus was nearer than any of them dreamed, and a bloody end was coming to the suitors in his house. And the suitors laughed the old man down, and told him to go home and read his bird signs to his own children, and to stop frightening them with an outcome that was never going to come. They were very sure, on that bright morning, that the missing king was never coming back at all. They would not give Telemachus a ship, so Athena, still watching over him, quietly saw to it herself a ship, and a crew of loyal young men. And that night, without a word to his mother, who would only have wept and begged him not to go, Telemachus slipped down to the dark harbour and sailed out onto the same sea that had swallowed his father, to go looking for him. The sun set out, in the 20th year, on his own small Odyssey, at almost the very hour that his father, at the far end of the world, was about to be set free. He went first to sandy Pylos, to old Nestor, the ancient horseman who had fought at Troy and lived to come safely home again, and who now told the boy everything he knew, the long, hard story of how the Greek kings had been scattered and battered on their voyages back, and how great Agamemnon had come home in triumph only to be cut down at his own table. But of Odysseus himself, Nestor had no news to give, only affection, and a quiet fear that the man was lost for good. So he sent Telemachus onward, overland, to Sparta. And in Sparta, in the rich hall of Menelaus and Helen, the very marriage that had set the whole war in motion, now reconciled and grown old and quiet together, Telemachus finally got his answer. But first, over the long dinner, the two of them fell to remembering Odysseus, and every story they told circled back to the same single trait, his bottomless cunning. Helen told how, during the war, Odysseus had once beaten himself black and bruised, thrown a slave's filthy rags over his shoulders, and slipped into Troy itself, in the disguise of a wretched beggar, to walk its streets and spy out the city, and how she alone had seen through the dirt and recognized him, and had kept his secret. Hold that small story somewhere in your mind, because the single greatest trick of Odysseus's whole life is going to be exactly this one, played again, for far higher stakes than a spy's afternoon, on his own doorstep. And then Menelaus told the boy the thing he had crossed the sea to hear. He told him how his own journey home had left him stranded for years in Egypt, and how, to get free, he had ambushed and wrestled down the shape-shifting old god of the sea, and forced out of him the fates of all the missing Greeks. And one of those fates was Odysseus. He is alive, the old sea god had said. Alive but weeping on an island, held there against his will by the nymph Calypso, with no ship and no crew and no way home. It was the first solid word anyone had heard of him in 20 years. Telemachus's father was alive. Out on that sea, at that very moment, he was alive. The boy had crossed the water and found the one thing he had come for. He had found hope. But hope had a knife hidden behind its back, because back on Ithaca, the suitors had discovered that Telemachus had slipped away and it frightened them, and their fear turned them vicious. A grown son of Odysseus, out sailing the seas, gathering allies and growing a backbone, was the one thing that could undo them all. So they fitted out a fast ship of their own and sent it to lie in wait in a narrow strait the boy would have to pass through on his way home, with a simple plan: to kill him quietly, out on the water, before he ever set foot on Ithaca again. And when word of both things reached Penelope at once, that her only son had secretly sailed off into danger, and that a boat full of armed men was now waiting in the dark to murder him, she broke. This was the one loss she had never once let herself imagine. She had held the line for 20 years against the sea, and the suitors, and her own despair, and now they meant to take her son from her as well. She wept and prayed, and would not be comforted, and for the first time the watching woman of Ithaca looked as though she might finally shatter under the whole weight of it. Hold that fear there for now. Unfinish the assassins waiting in the strait, the mother weeping in the dark, because we have to go back out to sea, to the other end of the god's plan, where a god was knocking at Calypso's door. Hermes came to the island as he had been ordered, and delivered the word of Zeus plainly. The gods have decided, Calypso, it is finished. You must let the mortal man go. And Calypso was bitter about it, she said, and she was not entirely wrong, that the gods were always quick to begrudge a goddess, the man she loved, but no one, not even a goddess, refuses a direct order from Zeus. So she went down to the shore, to the place where Odysseus sat in his usual spot, staring out at the water, and she told him he was free to go. He did not trust it at first. After 7 years, he suspected some trick, some fresh cruelty, and he would not lift a hand to help until she had sworn a great oath by the gods that she truly meant him no harm. Then, at last, he believed her. And Calypso did not rage in the end. She went quietly about helping him, which was in its way almost sadder. She had loved this broken, stubborn, homesick man for 7 years, and now she was the one who had to help him leave her forever for a mortal wife, and a poor rocky island, and, at the far end of it, for old age and death, all the things she could never give him, and that he wanted anyway. She gave him tools, and showed him where the tallest trees stood, and for 4 days Odysseus built himself a raft with his own hands, a wide, strong raft, the first thing in 10 years that had felt like moving toward home, and on the 5th day she gave him bread and wine, and a following wind, and he pushed off, alone, into the open sea. He steered by the stars, and kept them on his left as she had told him, and for the first time in 7 years, Odysseus was going home. For 17 days it went well, and on the 18th, with the shadowy hills of a new land just lifting over the edge of the sea ahead of him, land, real land, so close now Poseidon came home. The sea god was on his way back from his feast at the world's end, and he happened to look down, and he saw his enemy out there on a little raft, almost safe, almost arrived, and he was enraged. The other gods might have helped Odysseus behind his back, but he, at least, would have this. He gathered the clouds in his fists, and churned the sea with his trident, and hurled every wind in the world at that one small raft at once. A wave caught Odysseus and flung him off the raft into the water. The raft itself spun away like a scrap of bark. He very nearly drowned right there, dragged down by the heavy clothes the goddess had given him. But another sea goddess took pity on him, and rose up out of the waves, and gave him her own veil to bind around his chest, and told him to let go of the wreckage and swim, and to trust the cloth to hold him up. And so he swam. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights through that heaving sea, alone, with no land and no rest and no help but a goddess's veil, until his strength was very nearly gone out of him altogether. Twice the surf hurled him against a wall of cliffs and tore the skin from his hands, and he would have died there on the rocks if Athena had not put it into his mind to swim on along the coast until he found calmer water. And at last he came to the mouth of a river, and he prayed to the god of that river to take pity on a hopeless, drowning stranger. And the god heard him, and stilled his current, and held back the sea, and let the exhausted man come in. And on the 3rd day, half dead, his skin swollen with salt, his hands raw, Odysseus dragged himself out of the water at last, and up onto an unknown shore. He crawled away from the water, into the cover of a wood, and scraped together a heap of fallen leaves, and buried himself down in them, the way a man banks a last coal against the cold. And there, on the edge of a land he could not name, the last living man of all the ships that had sailed from Troy fell into a sleep like the dead. He did not know it yet, but he had very nearly made it. This was the last strange shore. The people who lived on this island were kind, and they had the fastest ships in the world, and they were going to be the ones, the strangers, exactly as the prophet in the underworld and the curse of the Cyclops had both promised, who would finally carry Odysseus home. Far behind him, his son was turning for home as well, with killers waiting for him in the water. The father and the son were both sailing toward Ithaca now, in the same year, at long last. And what happened next turned on a young girl, who came down to the river in the morning to wash her clothes. The land of the Phaeacians was the gentlest place Odysseus had washed up in 10 years, and it turned out to be the last stop before home. In the morning, a young princess named Nausicaa came down to that same river mouth with her maids to wash the palace linen, and while they were laughing and playing at ball on the sand, their voices woke the ragged, salt-crusted man asleep in the leaves. He came out to them, holding only a broken branch to cover himself, filthy and huge and frightening, and the girl, alone of all of them, did not run. She gave him clothing and food, and told him how to find her parents' house, and how to win their help. And the Phaeacians, who were the finest sailors in all the world, took the nameless stranger into their home exactly as the sacred law of guests demanded, and asked nothing of him. That night at the feast, a blind singer stood up to entertain the hall, and the song he happened to choose was the fall of Troy the wooden horse, and the sack of the city, and the famous deeds of the Greek captains. And the stranger at the table quietly drew his cloak up over his head, and wept, so that only the king noticed, because of course the stranger was Odysseus, and he was sitting there listening to a man who had never met him sing his own life back to him as an old, finished story as history, while every friend who had lived it lay dead at the bottom of the sea. The king asked him, kindly, who he was, and why a song about Troy should make a grown man weep into his cloak. And so Odysseus finally spoke his own name aloud, and told them his story, the whole long story that we have spent these hours together following. The Cyclops and the witch and the land of the dead, and the drowned men, and the 7 years on the island. Everything you have heard tonight. He told to that one quiet hall, in a single night. And the Phaeacians were so moved by it that they did the one thing he had almost stopped believing anyone would ever do for him. They took him home. They loaded one of their fast ships with treasure more gold and bronze than he had ever carried away from Troy, and they laid him down aboard it. And while he slept the deep and peaceful sleep of a man whose long ordeal is finally over, they carried him across the last stretch of dark water and set him down, still sleeping, on the shore of his own island. After 20 years, Odysseus came home to Ithaca unconscious, laid on the sand of a stranger's ship, exactly as the Cyclops had cursed him to not even awake to see it. The Phaeacians paid for their kindness too. As their ship sailed home, Poseidon, still nursing his grudge, struck it with his open hand and turned it to stone within sight of its own harbour. But that is their sorrow, not ours. Odysseus was home. He woke alone on a beach, with his heap of treasure beside him, and he did not know where he was. Athena had wrapped the whole coast in a grey mist, so that his own island looked foreign and strange to him. And for one bitter moment, the man who had crossed the entire world to get home was certain the Phaeacians had simply dumped him in yet another unknown country. Then the goddess came to him. She cleared away the mist, and she showed him the harbour he had sailed out of 20 years before, and the mountain, and the cave he knew, and she said the words he had been dying to hear for 2 decades. "You are home. This is Ithaca. And then, before he could even kneel down and kiss the ground of it, she told him the hard truth about his own homecoming. "You cannot walk into your house as its king," she said. "If you go up to that hall and announce yourself, 108 armed men will kill you on the spot, and your wife and your son along with you. You did not live through the whole sea just to die on your own doorstep out of pride. You will go in secret. You will go as nobody at all." And she reached out and laid her hands on him and changed him. She withered the strong body and thinned and greyed the hair, and dimmed the bright eyes, and hung on him the filthy rags and the whole appearance of a broken old beggar, the lowest and most overlooked thing in that entire world. This was the very disguise Helen had described that night in Sparta, the old trick from the war, now played for the highest stakes of his life. The king of Ithaca had finally come home, and the first thing he had to do, at home, was vanish. He did not go up to the palace. Athena sent him first, of all places, to a pig farm, to the hut of his own swineherd, a faithful old servant named Eumaeus, who had tended his master's pigs loyally for 20 years and never once let go of the hope that the man would come back. And here the poem does something quiet and beautiful and very pointed. This poor slave, who owned almost nothing in the world, took one look at the filthy old beggar standing at his gate and did the exact opposite of what the rich young lords up in the palace would have done. He welcomed him in. He brought the stranger out of the cold and killed one of his own young pigs to feed him, and gave him the warm seat by the fire and the best of the little he had, and asked for nothing in return because that was the sacred law of hospitality, the law that the gods themselves watched over, the very law that the 108 men devouring Odysseus's herds had trampled into the mud. The lowest man on the whole estate still kept the rule that the highest men had broken. And as the two of them sat by the fire, the old swineherd talked, with love and with grief, about his lost master, Odysseus never once dreaming that the ragged old beggar, warming his hands across the fire, was that master, sitting there and listening to every word. And it was there, at that pig farmer's fire, that the first great reunion of the whole homecoming happened, not with his wife, and not in his hall, but in a hut, between a father and a son who had never truly known each other. For Athena had brought Telemachus safely home, steering his ship wide of the killers lying in wait in the Strait, and she had sent the young man to the loyal swineherd's hut before he risked the palace. When the boy came in, the old beggar rose and offered him his seat with a stranger's politeness, and the two of them sat together, the father watching the son he had last held as a baby in arms, now grown tall and standing right in front of him, and not knowing him at all. Then Eumaeus stepped out to carry word to Penelope that her son was safe, and the moment they were alone, Athena gave Odysseus back his own true shape for just a few minutes, and he told the young man the truth. "I am your father," he said. "I am the man you have been searching the sea for." And Telemachus at first could not believe it, thought it must be a god playing a cruel trick on him, until at last he understood that it was real, and the two of them threw their arms around one another and wept. 20 years of missing each other coming loose all at once, in a hut that smelled of wood smoke and pigs. And then, because there was work to be done, they made themselves stop, and they made a plan. The disguise would hold. Telemachus would tell no one, not even his mother, not yet. They would go up to the palace separately, the king still hidden inside the beggar, and quietly find out which servants were still loyal, and wait for the right moment. And they both understood, without quite saying it out loud, that the right moment was going to end in blood. So the beggar walked up to his own palace, leaning on a stick, the swineherd at his side, and at the gate of the home he had not laid eyes on in 20 years. The very first living thing to know him was a dog. His name was Argos. Odysseus had raised him from a tiny pup with his own hands, long ago, in the last days before he sailed away to Troy, but he had left for the war before the dog was even fully grown, and had never once seen him run. Now Argos was ancient, worn out far past his years, forgotten. He lay tossed aside on a heap of dung by the gate, neglected, thick with ticks, too weak even to get to his feet. He had spent his entire long life waiting for a master he had barely known. And when the beggar came near, this dying old dog lifted up his head, and he knew him. At once, completely, straight through every disguise a goddess could lay over him, his ears lifted, and his tail stirred in the dust. Because after 20 years, the one creature in all of Ithaca who recognized Odysseus at a single glance was the dog he had left behind as a puppy. But Argos was too far gone to rise and come to him, and Odysseus could not let a single soul see that he cared, because a wandering beggar has no reason on earth to weep over some lord's forgotten old hound. So Odysseus turned his face away, and wiped away one tear where the swineherd would not catch it, and walked on into the house. And Argos, having done the one last thing his long life had been holding on for, having seen his master come home at last, laid his head back down in the dirt, and died. 20 years he had waited. He let go in the very hour that Odysseus returned. Of all the reunions in this whole long story, that is the one that stays with people longest, and it belongs to a dog. Inside his own hall, Odysseus had to endure the hardest test of all to be a beggar in the house that he owned, moving among the men who were eating it alive. He went around the tables asking for scraps of food and studying every face, learning exactly who these men were. Most of them tossed him a little something, but their ringleader, a hard and arrogant man named Antinous, cursed the old beggar for daring to exist, and snatched up a footstool, and threw it, and struck him full on the shoulder with it, and Odysseus, who could have broken the man in half with his bare hands, did not so much as stagger. He stood there, and he took it, and he said nothing at all, and he wrote that face down in his mind with all the others. Every insult flung at the beggar that day was another name being added to a list. He had waited 20 years. He could wait a few hours longer. There was one moment, that day, when the mask very nearly slipped. A real beggar named Ismarus, a big, lazy man, who had made himself the suitors' favourite errand runner, took offence at finding another beggar on what he thought of as his patch, and tried to drive Odysseus away from the doorway with threats and shoves. The suitors were delighted. They made a game of it. They set the two ragged old men to box each other for their amusement, and promised the winner a fat goat's stomach, roasting on the fire, to eat. And Odysseus, before he threw a single punch, quietly hitched up his rags, and the laughter died, because the arms and the thighs under those rags were not an old man's at all, but the huge, knotted limbs of a fighter in his prime. He struck Aeolus just once, carefully, holding himself back so as not to kill the man outright and give the whole game away, and dropped him bleeding into the dust of the doorway. The suitors roared and cheered and thumped the tables, and not one of them stopped to wonder what kind of broken old beggar carried a body like that underneath his rags. They were eating and joking, and completely blind to the thing that was sitting in the room with them. That evening, word reached Penelope that there was a strange traveller in the house who might have news of her husband, and she sent for him. And she sat with the ragged old man by the fire and questioned him closely, and he gave her careful half-truths that he had met Odysseus once, long ago, that her husband was alive and near, and coming home very soon. And she wanted so badly to believe it, and had been fed that same hope by so many passing strangers over the years, that she could not let herself trust it now. She did tell him one strange thing, though something that had been turning over and over in her mind. She had dreamed, she said, that a great eagle came sweeping down out of the sky and killed the flock of 20 geese that she kept and loved about the house, and that the eagle had then spoken to her in a human voice and told her that he was her own husband, come home at last, and that the geese were the suitors. What, she asked the ragged old stranger, could a dream like that possibly mean? And Odysseus, sitting there in his rags across the fire from his own wife, told her softly that a dream like that could mean only one thing, that Odysseus was coming, and that death was coming into that hall along with him, for every last man in it. But she only shook her head. Dreams are treacherous things, she said. Most of them mean nothing at all, and drift away by morning. She did not dare to let herself hope. She was speaking, and she had no idea of it, to the eagle himself. But she treated the old man with real kindness, and she gave orders that her most trusted servant should wash the tired traveller's feet before he slept an old woman named Euryclea, who had been Odysseus's own nurse when he was a baby, who had held him as a newborn in that very house. And that was the one thing the disguise could not survive, because as the old nurse washed the beggar's leg, her hands found a long, old scar high above his knee, a scar she knew, the mark of a boar's tusk that had torn him on a hunt when he was a young man, a scar she had washed 1,000 times when he was a boy. Her hands went still, she lifted her eyes to his face, and she knew him, and the tears came, and her mouth opened to cry his name out across the crowded hall, and Odysseus's hand shot out and closed around her throat, gently but hard enough, and he leaned close and breathed, "Yes, it is me, and you will say nothing, not one word, or you will undo everything and get us all killed." The old woman, trembling, understood, and she kept his secret. He had been home for hours now, in his own hall, and the only souls who knew it were a swineherd, a son, a dead dog, and one old woman sworn to silence. And upstairs, that same night, Penelope made the decision that would bring everything to its end. She was out of time, and out of tricks, and out of hope. The suitors would not wait one day longer. She would have to choose one of them, and choose him soon. And so, half in despair, and half moved by some feeling she could not have explained even to herself, she settled on how the choice would be made. There was a great bow in the house, a huge and ancient bow that had belonged to Odysseus, that no man but Odysseus had ever had the strength to string, and that had hung untouched on the wall for 20 years. Tomorrow, she decided, she would carry it out in front of all the suitors, and set up a line of 12 axe heads down the length of the hall, and she would marry any man who could string that great bow and send a single arrow cleanly through all 12 of them, the way her husband used to do it for sport, back when the house was still whole. It was, she believed, a nearly impossible test, a way to put off the dreadful choice for one more day, because surely not one of these soft, overfed men could do the thing that only Odysseus had ever been able to do. She did not know. She could not possibly have known that the one man in all the world who could string that bow was sitting downstairs beside her own fire that very night, dressed in rags, watching her and waiting. She went to the storeroom, and she took the great bow down from its peg, and she held it in her arms, and she wept over it, this thing her husband's hands had held all those years ago, and then she dried her eyes, and she carried it down to the hall. That morning, before the great bow was ever carried out, the house itself seemed to sense what was coming. At the feast, a strange and helpless laughter took hold of the suitors. They laughed and could not stop themselves, and the meat on their plates seemed to them to be dripping with blood. And a prophet among the guests, a man named Theoclymenus, went white and said that he could see the walls and the fine roof beams running wet with blood, and the doorway and the courtyard crowded with ghosts, drifting down toward the dark. The suitors only laughed the harder, and jeered at him, and told him to go outside if he did not care for the light in the hall. They could not see it. The one man in that room who could see the dead already gathering was the one man they would not listen to. Then the laughter wore itself out, and the tables were cleared, and Penelope came down the stairs with the great bow held in her arms. The contest of the bow began, and it began as a farce. One by one, the suitors came up to try their strength against the great bow of Odysseus, and one by one they failed even to bend it. They warmed it at the fire and rubbed it with fat to soften the old wood. They braced it against the floor and heaved with everything they had, and the bow would not give for any of them. These were strong men, young men, the pick of all the islands, and not one of them could so much as string the thing, let alone shoot it. And every failure made the fact they were all trying not to think about a little louder in that room, that there had once been a man who drew this bow as easily as drawing breath, and that they were only sitting here in his house, eating his food and courting his wife, because every one of them had decided he was never coming back. There is a terrible perfection in the test that Penelope had chosen, though she could not see it herself. Searching for the surest way to keep from giving herself to another man, she had landed, without knowing it, on the one feat in all the world that only her own husband had ever been able to perform. She meant the bow to be a door quietly closing on 20 years of hope. It was about to swing open instead. And then the ragged old beggar in the corner asked whether he might have a turn. The hall erupted. The suitors were insulted by the very idea. A filthy vagrant, daring to lay a hand on the weapon that had just beaten the best of them. But two things happened at once. Telemachus, with the new authority he had found, said that the bow was his to give, and that he would let the stranger try it if he liked, and, to clear the room, he sent his mother Penelope back up to her chambers, telling her gently that the bow was men's business now, and that she should not be there to see what came of it. It was the last kindness the boy could do her, to keep her out of the hall for what was about to happen inside it. And quietly, underneath all the shouting, the loyal servants did their work. Odysseus had already made certain of these two men. A little earlier, out in the yard, he had drawn the swineherd and the cowherd aside, and shown them the old scar on his leg, and told them the truth that their master had come home at last, and asked them, when the moment came, whether they would stand with him. They had wept, and sworn that they would. So now, under cover of all the noise, the two of them moved, The swineherd carried the great bow the length of the hall and placed it into the beggar's hands. The old nurse Eurycleia locked the women safely away in their quarters, and the doors of the hall itself were pulled shut and barred, so that no one inside could get back out. The trap that had been built for Odysseus 20 years before, in a courtyard in Sparta, had one last door left to close, and it was closing now, softly, with 108 men on the wrong side of it, and not one of them had noticed. Odysseus turned the great bow over in his hands, slowly, checking it the way a man checks something precious that he has not held in a very long time. The suitors laughed at him. And then, without any strain at all, as easily as a singer loops a new string onto his lyre and turns the peg to tune it, the old beggar bent that huge bow and slipped the cord into its notch. The laughing stopped. He plucked the string once with his thumb, and it sang out, high and clear, like the cry of a swallow. And far away, out of a clear sky, Zeus sent a single clap of thunder rolling over the house, a sign, and only Odysseus knew what it meant. Then he took up one arrow that lay ready on the table, and fitted it to the string, and drew it back, still sitting where he was, not even rising from his low stool, and he sent that arrow straight down the whole length of the hall, cleanly through the rings of all 12 axe heads in a row, and on into the wall beyond. Not one man made a sound. They had just watched a broken old beggar do the single thing that only Odysseus, in all the world, had ever been able to do. And then Odysseus stood up, and let the rags fall away from him, and sprang onto the wide stone threshold of the hall, with the bow in his hand, and the arrows poured out at his feet. And he spoke, in his own voice at last. "The contest is over," he said. "Now I will find out whether I can hit a mark that no man has ever hit before me." And he turned the bow on the suitors. His first arrow took Antinous the ringleader, the man who had thrown the footstool at the beggar, straight through the throat as he was lifting a golden cup to his lips, so that he died with the wine still in his mouth and never understood what had killed him. For one moment the others thought it was an accident, a wild shot from a fool, and they shouted in anger and looked to the walls for the weapons that always hung there, and the weapons were gone. Telemachus had taken every one of them down in the night, and then the beggar told them who he was. "I am Odysseus," he said. "I am the man whose house you have devoured, and whose wife you have courted, and whose death you are all so very certain of. I have come home, and the fear that went through that hall was the particular fear of men who understand, all at once, that they are already dead. What followed was not truly a battle, it was a reckoning, and it was terrible, and the poem does not look away from it, so neither will we pretend it was gentle. Odysseus held the threshold the only way out, and killed them with the bow until the arrows were gone, and then with spear and sword. Telemachus fought at his father's shoulder, a son and a father defending their home side by side for the first and only time in their lives. The swineherd and the cowherd, the two servants who had stayed loyal, fought beside them. The one traitor among the servants tried to smuggle armour across to the suitors, and was caught. And Athena herself was there at the end, above the hall, so that no spear the suitors threw ever found its mark, and every shaft Odysseus loose did. One by one, and then in heaps, the 108 men who had feasted in that hall for years were cut down inside it, until the great room was silent, and the floor of the house ran with the men who had tried to take it. There was mercy in it, in the narrow way that world understood mercy. The singer Phemius, who had been made to perform for the suitors against his will, was spared, and so was the herald, because they had done no true wrong. But the servants who had betrayed the house from the inside were not spared, and their end was hard, and we will leave it at that. Then Odysseus had the whole hall cleansed with fire and sulphur, the smoke carrying the horror of it up and out through the roof, until the home that had been fouled for 20 years was, at last, his own clean house again. And only then did he send the old nurse back up the stairs to wake his wife, and to tell her that the beggar who had sat all evening by her fire had been her husband all along, and that the waiting, after 20 years, was finally over. And here we come to the very heart of the whole story, not the killing, but the quiet room afterward, and a bed. Eurycleia ran up the stairs with the news, overjoyed. "It is him. It was him all along. Your husband has come home, and the men who plagued you are dead." And Penelope, and this is the thing that makes her the true equal of Odysseus, and the real other half of this story, Penelope did not come running down to throw herself into his arms. She had been fooled too many times, by too many hopeful rumours, over too many years. She had spent 20 years being careful, and she was not about to stop being careful now, at the very last moment, and let herself be tricked by some cruel stranger, or by some god wearing her husband's face. So she came down slowly, and she sat herself across the room from the man, and she looked at him, and she said nothing at all. Her own son was angry with her for it. "How can you sit so far from him," he said, "so cold, so hard, when your husband has come home to you at last?" But Odysseus, watching her, understood exactly what she was doing, and something in him nearly smiled. Of course she was testing him. She was the one person left alive who was every bit as careful as he was. So she set her trap the last clever trick in a story that is full of them, and by far the most loving. She turned to the old nurse and, as though it were the smallest thing in the world, she gave an order. "Go," she said, "and move the great bed out of our bedchamber, and make it up with fresh blankets out here, so that this stranger may sleep on it." And Odysseus came apart. "Move the bed?" he cried, and there was real anger in it, and real grief, because she had reached out and touched the one thing in the world he could not stand to hear moved. "Woman, no living man could move that bed. I built it myself, with my own 2 hands, and it holds a secret." There was an olive tree growing in the courtyard once, a living tree, its trunk as thick as a pillar, and I built our bedchamber around that tree, and I cut and shaped our marriage bed out of its living trunk, still rooted in the ground where it grew. Our bed is a living tree. It cannot be carried anywhere by anyone, unless some man has taken an axe to the trunk and cut it free of the earth. So tell me, is it still there where I left it? Or has someone cut our bed loose from the ground? And that was the proof, because only 2 people in all the world had ever known that the bed was rooted in the living earth: the husband who had built it, and the wife who had slept in it. No disguise could fake it. No god could steal it. It was the one secret that belonged only to the 2 of them, and to their marriage, and to that single house on that single island. And when Penelope heard him describe, it heard the raw dismay of a man who believed his own bed might have been cut loose from the ground beneath it. Her knees went weak, and the last of her guard fell away, and she crossed that room at last and threw her arms around his neck, and wept, and begged him not to be angry with her for being so slow, and so careful, and so afraid, because it was that very carefulness, that stubborn refusal ever to be fooled, that had kept her faithful, and kept the bed rooted, through 20 years of men trying to move it. Their whole marriage was that olive tree, grown down into the ground of one particular place, impossible to carry off, impossible to replace, and alive. And the 2 of them held on to each other and cried the way people cry when they have swum a very long way, and have finally felt solid ground come up under their feet. And Athena, watching over the pair of them still, did one last kindness. She held back the dawn. She kept the long night from ending, and made the morning wait out at the edge of the world, so that Odysseus and Penelope could lie awake together in their own rooted bed and tell each other everything, 20 years of it, all his wanderings and all her waiting, poured out into the dark until there was nothing left unspoken between them. The 2 clocks that had started ticking together on a beach 20 years before, one out on the wide sea, and one in this quiet house, had finally, at the very last, stopped at the same hour. There was one homecoming still left to make. In the morning, Odysseus walked out to the farm where his old father Laertes had gone to grieve, and he found the old man there, in the dirt among his vines, in a patched and filthy tunic, worn down to almost nothing by mourning a son he was sure was long dead. And Odysseus proved himself to his father in the gentlest way he could find. He walked with the old man through the orchard, and he named the trees these 13 pear trees, and these 10 apple trees, and these 40 figs, the very trees that Laertes had once given him to call his own, when he was a small boy trailing after his father through this same garden, a whole lifetime ago, before any of it had happened. And the old man knew his son again by the trees they had planted together. And 3 generations stood in that orchard in the morning sun, Laertes, and Odysseus, and Telemachus, a grandfather, and a father, and a son, all of them in one place, at home, at the same time, at last. It was not quite finished, even then. The families of the dead suitors rose up, the way grieving families do, to take their revenge, and for one moment it looked as though the killing would simply roll on, generation into generation, the way it so often does. But the gods had finally had enough of it. Athena came down, and Zeus sent a bolt of warning down out of the sky, and between the two of them they stopped the fighting cold, and made both sides swear a lasting peace. The debt was paid, the house was clean, the killing was over, and Ithaca, which had begun this whole story 20 years earlier as a kingdom holding its breath, was allowed, at long last, to let that breath out, and to be quiet, and to be at peace. So let us hold the whole of it in our minds now, one last time, before we let it go for the night. It began with a wedding, and a clever man who did not want to go to a war, and a great wooden horse standing in the dark. It passed through the smoke of a burning city, and the greed of hungry men on a beach, and the single eye of a giant, and a bag of winds opened in plain sight of home. It passed through a witch's island, and the grey shore of the dead, and a song that promised all the knowledge in the world, and a monster who took 6 men, and a herd of forbidden cattle that cost him all the rest. It passed through 7 years of weeping on a goddess's shore, and 3 years of weaving and unweaving a shroud in a lamplit room, and a boy who grew up and sailed out looking for a father he had never truly known. And it ended, all of it ended, exactly where it had always been trying to go, in a small stone house, on a small stony island, with a dog that had waited a little too long, and an old scar above a knee, and a bed that could not be moved, and 2 stubborn people who had refused, for 20 years and against the whole weight of the world, to stop belonging to one another. That is the Odyssey. Underneath all the gods and all the monsters, it was only ever the longest way home, and the 2 people who kept the light burning at the end of it. And that is where we leave Odysseus and Penelope and the island of Ithaca, tonight home at last, under their own roof, in their own rooted bed, with the long waiting finally over, and the lamp in the high window free, after 20 years, to go out. If you are still awake, there is another slow story waiting for you on the screen right now, and if this one stayed with you, you are welcome to leave a like, or to subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below, only if you truly want to. But there is nothing left to watch for now. The ships are all home, the doors are all barred, the fire has burned down low and warm. So let your shoulders drop, the way we let them drop together at the very start of all this. Let the day go, let the lamp in the window go out, and let your eyes close. Wherever you are tonight, and however far from home you might feel, you are home enough, for now, and it is time to rest. Good night, sleep well, and we will be here, whenever you're ready, with another story.